the 21st century, whoever controls green energy holds the keys to the global economy. The real question is not whether the green transition will happen, but who is leading the game. And more importantly, whether the United States and the West can still compete, or whether they have already been overtaken and overwhelmed by China. Images of massive battery factories, towering wind turbines, and millions of electric vehicles moving through Chinese cities already tell the story. This is not just a technological trend. It is a struggle for economic and geopolitical power. The world is now saturated with terms such as net zero, climate change, and green transition. Governments, businesses, and consumers all recognize the need to move away from fossil fuels and toward a sustainable future. Yet amid these passionate discussions, one core question is often avoided. Who actually controls the critical inputs of this transition? Who decides prices? And who has the ability to disrupt the entire global supply chain? Because the green transition is not simply an environmental issue, it is power. It is the power to shape the future of industry, trade, and even national security. And when it comes to this kind of power, China operates on a completely different level. The latest data show that China is not just a major player, but the one controlling the game. In the year 2025 alone, China installed more than 60 gigawatts of solar power in the first quarter, and total installed wind and solar capacity reached 360 gigawatts, accounting for more than half of the global total. By the year 2026, China is expected to add roughly 200 to 250 gigawatts more renewable capacity, primarily solar power. This means that China's solar manufacturing capacity is now more than double what the world would need to reach net zero by the year 2050. Chinese scientists are also leading breakthrough innovations such as perovskite solar cells with efficiencies exceeding 25%, while driving production costs below 0.1 US dollars per watt peak, a price level no competitor can realistically match. So what exactly is China controlling? We can think of four major power switches that Beijing now holds. Power switch number one is overwhelming manufacturing dominance. By the year 2025, China accounts for more than 80% of global solar panel and wind turbine production. In electric vehicle batteries, Chinese companies such as CATL and BYD controlled roughly 68.9% of the global market in the year 2025, and are projected to reach 80 to 85% of global battery market share by the year 2030. This is not dominance by a few isolated firms, but by an entire industrial ecosystem spanning component manufacturing, processing, and final assembly. Even in electric vehicles, where Western automakers continue to struggle, EV sales in China rose 18% in the year 2025, accounting for 54% of the domestic market. China does not need a monopoly. It only needs overwhelming scale. Power switch number two is control of upstream supply chains. This is the true heart of the green transition. By the year 2026, China controls 60 to 70% of global rare earth mining and holds near total dominance in processing and refining these materials. Rare earth elements are essential for permanent magnets used in wind turbines and electric vehicle motors, accounting for roughly 80 to 95% of total supply. Beyond rare earths, China also occupies key positions in the supply chains for lithium, nickel, and graphite, all critical raw materials for battery production. Whoever controls raw materials controls the pulse of the green transition. New Chinese export controls introduced in the year 2025, restricting products containing Chinese rare earths, have already disrupted global supply chains and forced other countries to confront the reality of their deep dependence. Power switch number three is unmatched cost advantage. Chinese green technology products are often 30 to 60% cheaper than their Western counterparts. This advantage comes from massive production scale, fully optimized supply chains from start to finish, and strong government support policies. For example, China's newly commercialized sodium-ion battery technology is roughly 30% cheaper than lithium batteries. This pricing advantage allows China to eliminate competitors without direct confrontation. When low-cost Chinese products flood global markets, Western manufacturers, burdened by higher labor costs and stricter environmental regulations, struggle to compete. Power switch number four is speed and scale of deployment. China can build a battery or the solar panel manufacturing facility in just a few months and scale it up within a few years. In contrast, in the West, a comparable project can take 7 to 10 years to complete due to permitting hurdles, environmental reviews, and labor constraints. The key takeaway is this: no one loses because their technology is inferior. They lose because they cannot keep up with the pace. This speed is not only a competitive advantage, but also a geopolitical tool, allowing China to rapidly fill market gaps and build dependencies that are difficult to reverse. China has also begun investing hundreds of billions of dollars into green technology projects overseas, sparking discussions of a second phase of the Belt and Road, often referred to as Belt and Road version 2.0 or the Green Belt and Road Initiative. Since the pandemic, China has sharply accelerated its overseas green technology investments. According to the Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab, overseas investment increased fivefold from the year 2020 to 2021, then quadrupled again in the year 2022, and nearly doubled during the period from 2022 to 2024. In the year 2024, China invested more than $70 billion in overseas green technology projects across 54 countries in every continent. By the first half of the year 2025, green investment reached a record $9.7 billion, with 9.7 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity installed across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It is important to clarify that these projects are not primarily aimed at directly generating renewable energy. Chinese companies are not building overseas solar farms or wind parks to sell electricity. Instead, they are building factories to manufacture items such as solar panels, electric vehicle batteries, and their core components. For example, Chinese firms have built battery factories in Indonesia to take advantage of the country's abundant nickel reserves. Companies such as CATL have also invested heavily in Indonesian nickel mines. Most of this investment continues to flow into Southeast Asia, where raw materials are plentiful and production costs are competitive. This reflects a carefully calculated strategy to internationalize supply chains, not only to optimize profits, but also to reinforce China's geopolitical influence. So what is really driving this massive wave of Chinese investment? A significant part comes from the basic economic interests of Chinese companies themselves. There is now excessive production capacity within China, leading to intense competition for limited raw materials and growing risks of overcapacity. As a result, Chinese firms can gain a competitive edge by building factories in other countries, where raw materials are more abundant and labor costs are lower, allowing output prices to fall accordingly. This is a rational strategy to reduce production costs and diversify supply sources. But the internationalization of China's green supply chains also delivers strategic advantages to the Chinese Communist Party. By investing early and dominating these supply chains, the party can effectively set global standards for green technology products. Other countries will understand that they must align their regulations and technical standards with China if they want smooth trade with the world's largest green technology producer. This not only grants China global influence, but also allows Beijing to shape the rules of the game in ways that favor its own industries. This was once a strength of the European Union, often described as a regulatory superpower. But China is now rapidly assuming this position in the field of green technology. In practice, this strategy also helps Chinese companies reduce the impact of the growing wave of protectionism around the world. Many countries have decided that they want to build their own domestic green technology industries, and they are introducing protectionist measures such as tariffs, subsidies, and local content requirements. The most well-known example is the United States Inflation Reduction Act, which offers generous tax incentives to encourage foreign companies to set up manufacturing operations directly inside the United States. But the United States is not alone. Other countries, such as Brazil, are also offering preferential financing packages for green technology companies that use locally sourced components. By placing manufacturing facilities inside host countries, Chinese companies can bypass these protectionist barriers and sell their products directly into local markets. Moreover, producing goods outside China does not only give Chinese companies access to the domestic markets of host countries, it also opens the door to other markets that maintain trade barriers against China itself. This is especially valuable in the context of the ongoing trade conflict between China and the United States, where Washington has imposed average tariffs of roughly 47% on imports from China. Chinese firms have partially worked around these barriers by building factories in countries such as Vietnam or the Philippines, which can export to the United States at significantly lower tariff rates. Some Chinese companies are now pursuing similar strategies in Thailand, Cambodia, and Malaysia, countries that recently negotiated preferential access to the United States market during an ASEAN summit. Likewise, To avoid European Union trade restrictions, Chinese firms are investing in projects in Germany, Hungary, and Spain. Over the long term, these overseas green technology investments could help China address its domestic problem of excess industrial capacity. At present, Chinese companies are producing far more than the domestic market can absorb. This imbalance between supply and demand has pushed China into a deflationary environment. Because when supply greatly exceeds demand, prices tend to fall. While cheaper goods may sound appealing, economists generally agree that deflation is harmful to an economy. When consumers expect prices to continue falling, they have little incentive to spend. At the same time, deflation makes existing debt harder to repay, slowing the entire economy as both households and businesses cut back on spending to stay solvent. This is a particularly serious issue in China, where overall debt levels are already considered dangerously high. Shifting production outside China can therefore reduce domestic oversupply while simultaneously supporting economic development in host countries. This outcome is highly beneficial for China because wealthier neighboring economies can become new sources of demand for Chinese exports. As a result, Beijing can continue to maintain large trade surpluses even as countries like the United States attempt to reduce their dependence on Chinese goods. This dynamic is also why the current wave of green investment is often compared to the original Belt and Road Initiative. One of the key advantages of the earlier initiative was that it helped Chinese companies export goods abroad, sustaining large trade surpluses and creating steady external demand for Chinese production. While comparisons to the Belt and Road Initiative are sometimes overstated, especially since the original program relied heavily on state-backed lending, whereas the current wave of overseas investment is driven largely by Chinese private firms and direct investment, the core similarity remains clear. Both approaches allow Chinese companies to enter new markets and can even help host countries become wealthier, thereby generating greater demand for Chinese exports. In addition, both strategies strengthen China's international dominance in specific industries. The difference is that the earlier Belt and Road Initiative focused primarily on traditional industrial production, while the Green Belt and Road Initiative concentrates on strategically critical green technologies. So where do the United States and the broader Western world stand in this high-stakes competition? They are not completely out of the game, but their position is increasingly unstable. The West's strength lies in research and development, foundational technologies, and deep capital markets. Western countries remain leaders in scientific innovation and breakthrough discoveries. However, their weaknesses are substantial. Manufacturing costs are high, supply chains are fragmented, and dependence on China for raw materials and components remains deep. The key insight is simple. The West leads in invention, but China leads in deployment and commercialization. So is this truly a case of Chinese dominance? The answer appears to be yes. China does not only control supply chains, it also controls pricing across most essential green technology products. This places the West in a difficult paradox. Blocking China could slow down the West's own green transition. For example, imposing high tariffs on Chinese solar panels or electric vehicles may protect young industries in the United States and Europe, but it also raises prices. Consumers and businesses would have to pay more for green technology, slowing progress toward climate targets. While the United States is attempting to reduce risk by distancing itself from Chinese supply chains, policies such as the Inflation Reduction Act are still not sufficient to compete on price. Europe, meanwhile, is caught between accepting cheaper Chinese products or choosing more expensive domestic alternatives. So does the West still have a way out? Yes, but it is a path that is extremely expensive, very slow, and requires deep and sustained cooperation. The options include diversifying supply chains by investing heavily in countries outside China, accepting much higher production costs to relocate manufacturing back home or into allied nations, or continuing to tolerate dependence on China. Each of these paths demands massive investment in mining, processing, and manufacturing infrastructure over many decades, with estimated costs that could be 2 to 3 times higher than producing in China. The question is no longer whether China controls green energy. The question is whether the world can transition to clean energy without relying on China. This is the geopolitical reality the West now faces. If you were a policymaker in the United States or Europe, would you choose direct confrontation, accepting higher costs and a slower green transition, or accept China's dominance in order to reach climate goals faster?